A routine blood test holds the key to life and death. For Jesica Santilian, it was a missed opportunity, a tragic twist of fate that left her family, friends, and the entire medical community devastated. With grave lessons to learn and many chilling aspects to the story, her story is one the world will never forget in a hurry.
Jessica from Mexico had her second heart and lung transplant in an operation at Duke University. The first had failed because the donor had the wrong blood type. The second transplant went well at first, but complications have developed. The 9-year-old's brain is swelling, and her family may soon have to decide whether to take her off life support.
Born on 26th December 1985, Jesica hailed from the small town of Arroyo Hondo, near Guadalajara, Mexico. Guadalajara is a place known for its massive population, about 1.5 million people currently, as well as its rich history and culture. Even as far back as the 90s, it was still one of the best places to live in Mexico. However, the small village she hailed from had a small population that focused on agriculture. Jesica was daughter to Melicio Huerto and Magdalena Santillan. They were a decent couple with a fairly decent standard of living. Their entire family consisted of Jesica, her parents, her 2 siblings, as well as her aunt, uncle, and cousin. But Jesica, a young girl from a seemingly normal family, was born into a world of pain. From the moment she left the hospital with her mother when she was little, it was clear something was terribly wrong. She often vomited blood, suffered from headaches, and had constant fevers. The doctors were baffled. At first, they thought it was anemia, but iron pills didn't help. Then, they suspected a heart problem, but they couldn't pinpoint the exact issue. Jessica's parents, Melicio and Magdalena, watched helplessly as their daughter's health deteriorated. They were desperate for answers, but each doctor seemed more clueless than the last. It was a medical mystery that would haunt the Santillan family for years to come. Little did they know, their daughter's suffering was just beginning. The health problems kept piling up for young Jesica, and it seemed like they'd never end. Even at school, she often collapsed in the middle of class, and this would send teachers and students into a frenzy. Her parents were desperate for answers as they watched their daughter's condition worsen by the day. After 12 long years of searching, her parents finally took her to Texas, hoping an American doctor could solve the mystery. It was there they learned that she had restrictive cardiomyopathy. This deadly condition meant her heart's left ventricle wasn't filling with enough blood to pump through her body. To understand how serious this is, the heart has 2 ventricles. The right ventricle sends blood low on oxygen to the lungs. Once the lungs fill it with oxygen, the left ventricle pumps that fresh blood to the aorta, which delivers it to the rest of the body. In Jessica's case, the left ventricle wasn't doing its job. Without enough blood being pumped, her body was barely getting the oxygen it needed. This condition was the underlying cause of all her health issues. She had been running on empty for years, and nobody knew why. With the diagnosis finally in hand, the family returned home, knowing what was really behind Jessica's lifelong struggle. They had the answer, but it came too late to undo the years of suffering. The truth was a heavy burden, one that weighed on them as they came to grips with how close they had been to losing her all along. However, knowing the cause of Jessica's illness was one thing, but solving it was a whole different battle. Jessica needed treatment, and everyone knew it would cost a fortune. Time was running out. They needed a whole lot for the treatment, but how would the family raise enough money to save her? After finishing 6th grade in 1997, Jessica started working as a housekeeper for her neighbor. It was a tough job, especially with her health issues. She still fainted and felt exhausted regularly, but there was no other option. Money had to be made. The fight for her life had begun, and she was in the thick of it. Her family was deeply worried about her. Finding money for her treatment was one hurdle, but finding someone capable of performing the surgery was another. Local doctors had already told them they couldn't handle her case. Even across Mexico, there was no guarantee she could get the care she needed. The only hope seemed to be taking Jesica abroad for treatment. But how could a family of modest means afford to fly her overseas? Even if they did, what guarantee was there that Jesica would be properly treated and fully cured? In March 1999, the Santillan family decided to take a huge risk. Despite having little money and no ability to speak English, they made the bold choice to migrate to the US. They believed that if there was any place where she could receive the life-saving treatment she desperately needed, it was the US. It was a gamble, but one they were willing to take, hoping the move would finally bring the help Jesica had been waiting for all her life. This decision stemmed from the fact that over in the US, Jesica had an aunt living in Lewisburg, North Carolina, and according to her, there was a place that might solve the problem of treating Jesica's illness. And that was Duke Medical Center, one of the best in the state. Nicknamed the City of Medicine, Duke had top doctors and surgeons with a reputation for success. So ideally, the family felt hopeful. Her aunt also mentioned that there were plenty of job opportunities in the US if they needed work to support themselves. The idea of a fresh start, with hope for both Jesica's treatment and their financial future, made the US seem like a haven. But getting there wasn't easy. The Santillans had to pay $5,000 to Coyote, or a smuggler who helped people cross the US-Mexico border for a fee. This was a massive sum for them, and they spent months saving every bit of money they could. It took the combined effort of the whole family to finally gather enough for the journey. The family of 5 packed up what little they owned, along with the last of their savings, and began the dangerous journey to the border, clinging to the hope that America would offer the help Jesica needed. But just as they reached the border, something terrible happened. Their dream of a new life and Jesica's treatment was suddenly in jeopardy before they had even crossed into the US. The journey through the Sonoran Desert was supposed to lead the Santillans safely into Texas, but as they crossed the desert, they were attacked by robbers who took everything they had. The family's money, clothes, and even Jesica's earnings were stolen. This was a devastating blow that left them penniless and unsure of how they would survive in the US, let alone pay for Jesica's treatment. However, reaching America was just the beginning of their troubles. With nothing left after the robbery, the family faced a grim reality, questioning where they would stay and what they would eat. And most importantly, how would they afford Jesica's life-saving medical treatment? Desperate, they reached out to family and friends for help. They were able to gather enough assistance to travel from Texas to North Carolina, where they could regroup. Upon arriving in Lewisburg, friends briefed them on what they needed to know as new immigrants in the US. Jesica's father, determined not to let their American dream die, took a job as a construction worker the moment they arrived. His wife, Magdalena, found work as a housekeeper at a local college. Neither of them had planned for such a hard life in America, but they refused to give up. The family was forced to live in a cramped trailer, barely scraping by. Feeding a family of 5, including Jesica, who was still seriously ill, was no small feat. They even had to beg on the streets for extra money just to get by. It was a harsh reality, far from the life they had imagined, and a reminder that their struggle was far from over. But they held on to hope, clinging to the possibility that Jesica might still receive the help she needed. Begging for help was nearly impossible for the Santillan family. None of them spoke English well, and this made it difficult to communicate with strangers and ask for assistance. Feeding themselves and paying for basic household needs became a daily struggle. Meanwhile, Jesica's condition worsened. She was constantly out of breath, and her health was deteriorating rapidly. Desperate, the family finally brought Jesica to Duke Medical Center. After running tests, doctors confirmed their worst fears. Jesica had developed pulmonary hypertension, on top of her existing heart condition. Pulmonary hypertension is a serious condition where the blood pressure in the arteries leading from the heart to the lungs becomes dangerously high. This leads to symptoms like shortness of breath, dizziness, and chest pain, symptoms that Jesica had been battling for some time. The diagnosis made it clear that her health was rapidly declining and that her condition was critical. The doctors didn't mince words. They told the Santillans that without immediate treatment, Jesica would not survive. The only solution was a heart transplant and a double lung transplant. This was her only chance, but it came with significant risks and costs and left the family with even more uncertainty about how they would move forward. Now, if you know anything about medical procedures, you'd know that transplants cost a lot of money. Heart transplants nowadays cost over $1 million, so it's easy to imagine how expensive Jesica's treatment would be back then, given that she needed both heart and lung transplants. It was in the year 2000 that doctors recommended this heart-lung transplant, and they pinned the cost of the operation at $500,000. Jesica's condition grew worse by the day, especially as she had developed a comorbidity. She was always short of breath after every little exertion. The family was faced with two challenges: finding a donor and getting money for the treatment. And the situation would have been a lot better if the family qualified for Medicaid. However, since they were illegal immigrants, they couldn't be a part of the program, so they had to rely on donations from friends, local churches, and civic groups. Nevertheless, some respite came after a local businessman got wind of their predicament and decided to set up a foundation to help Jesica. Contributions were made to the foundation to raise money for her treatment, as her parents' income was nowhere near enough to foot the bills. Over time, things were beginning to look hopeful for the Santillans, as they slowly began to build up a lot of supporters to help fund their cause. A few newspapers also published their plight, causing more helpers to locate the family. Mac Mahoney was one such helper, a wealthy Louisburg home builder with a remarkable reputation. Mahoney traced the family, befriended them, and set up a foundation to fund Jesica's surgery. This happened in August 2000, when he went ahead to establish a nonprofit foundation in her name to help pay the bills. The foundation was called Jesica's Hope Chest. The mission statement of the foundation stated that it was dedicated to help critically ill children up to the age of 18 years old. The foundation would cover bills and other necessities which are not covered by private medical insurance programs or government medical aid programs. Besides the foundation, Mahoney also built structures using his knowledge and expertise on building construction and sold them for huge sums of money, eventually sending all the profits to the foundation he had set up for Jesica. Plus, he also received the power of attorney over Jesica's health, meaning he was literally her spokesperson. This was a very important thing, seeing as Jesica's parents weren't learned enough or fluent in English. And so, if the media needed any information or updates on Jesica's welfare, he was their go-to person. Even with the foundation and everything already done for the family, Mahoney still spent tens of thousands of his own money when Jesica was due for the heart-lung transplant. The money spent was due to the long protocols involved in scheduling a transplant for Jesica. In the United States, the organ transplant system is a delicate dance. To receive a donated organ, patients must undergo rigorous evaluation. They're assessed for their suitability and, if approved, added to a waiting list. But the list is a first-come, first-served basis, since organs aren't always readily available. Plus, doctors also cross-check the list to find patients that are best fits for a newly donated organ whenever it's available. So sometimes these protocols are routinely flouted, and desperate patients unable to wait for a legal transplant turn to black market networks. However, it wasn't until much later that Jesica was finally put on the transplant list at Duke because she had to wait for a donor to be found. She needed a heart and lungs transplant, two organs that don't come in pairs. So transplanting them from a donor would mean the donor's death. Two organizations at Duke Hospital were responsible for sourcing the new heart and lungs. In May 2002, Jesica's doctors at the Duke Hospital placed her on the waiting list for a heart-lung transplant. But before she could undergo the transplant, she had to undergo some other treatments, like multiple cardiac catheterizations. This particular surgery involves making a small laceration in a vein or artery to obtain diagnostic information about a person's heart. Since Jesica was set to receive a heart transplant, this procedure was highly necessary. However, it cost several thousands of dollars, money the Santillans could only dream of. So it was Mahoney who sponsored the procedure from his own money to ensure Jesica's hopes of living a long, healthy life became a reality. Luckily for her, the following year, on February 3rd to be precise, the Santillans got a call from a donor team. A donor had been found. The family were happy, especially after their long 9-month wait for a matching donor. But, unknown to everyone, the lab responsible for checking the compatibility of the donors had failed to do so, and ended up donating a wrong organ. This small mix-up would later become a very costly mistake, with grave consequences. The mix-up began with Dr. Shin Ho of Duke Medical Center, a medical professional tasked with procuring and transporting organs. On February 7th, 2003, he had traveled to Boston to collect the donated organs, but unfortunately, he never cared to verify Jesica's blood type. He was informed that the organs were type A and without further checks, accepted them, signed the necessary papers, and proceeded back to North Carolina. Back at Duke Hospital, preparations were underway. The doctors were eager to transplant the fresh organs. Little did they know that a fatal mistake had been made. The lead surgeon for the operation was Dr. James Jaggers. After all the prepping was done, Dr. Jaggers slowly removed her heart and lungs and then fitted in the new ones. The new organs looked good and seemed to fit Jesica perfectly. Not long after, the operation was done. Jesica was taken off the ventilator. It was time to test the new lungs and heart to see how they would work. But nothing would prepare them for the shocking tragedy that would follow moments after. You see, after the transplant, everyone had thought Jesica would bounce back to life. Unfortunately, this wasn't the case. Rather, her body began to shut down. About 40 minutes after she was taken off the ventilator and put under observation, doctors noticed her organs began to deteriorate. Her heart wasn't beating normally and she began to turn blue. There was something very wrong with the transplant, something the medical staff and even the surgeon didn't take notice of until the last minute.
We take responsibility for our part in that error. What was missing is a backup system, redundancies, to protect a single oversight to lead to this kind of tragedy. With heart-lung transplantation in particular, there are a series of handoffs. The organs are sent to us from another institution. It is in those handoffs that the mistake occurred.
Jesica was immediately put on life support to avoid her life slipping away. She was bleeding internally and already had acute renal failure. Her organs were failing fast, and as hours went by, she would often pass out. That was the story for the next few days. Nothing changed. She simply drifted in and out of consciousness while doctors battled to save her life. It was a very scary situation, as everyone, including Jesica's family and the medical staff attending to her, could see that the young lady was on the verge of death. Nobody knew what went wrong. They all thought the transplant was a failure, but nobody cared to question if the right procedures or steps were taken in procuring organs for her. No one cared to know if this was another act of medical negligence, or was Jesica simply too far gone to be rescued. Jesica grew worse by the day. She started having heart attacks and also lost the ability to speak. The doctors and nurses were thrown into panic, wondering what had gone wrong. Once, Jesica managed to muster up all the strength in her body to say, "Help me. can't believe I'm dying. It was pure agony and pain for all, especially her parents, who had sacrificed so much to get to this point. It was a bizarre situation as they watched their daughter slowly slip away by the minute, so the hospital ordered multiple lab tests to figure out what was wrong, and that's when reality hit. It was on the 7th of February, a few days after Surgeon James Jaggers had already stitched the patient back in place, that the lab discovered the error in the organs transplanted. They had come from a patient with type A blood, while Jessica's blood was type O.
Did you ever have a conversation with Carolina Donor Services in which you were informed of the donor's blood type?
Honestly, don't think that I heard that.
They say that they told you about it in the telephone conversation in the morning. You have no recollection of that?
I have no recollection of them talking about the blood type.
You didn't ask them for any blood type information?
No, I didn't.
Should you have done that?
I had satisfied in my own mind that if they had offered the organs for me, that she was a match.
There was panic. Unless by some miracle or magic, there was no way the aftermath of the operation would be a success, because it was known now that the patient would surely die. You see, the human body has specific blood traits. For instance, blood type A and B have antigens specific to them. These antigens are important players in the body's immune system. However, blood type O has no antigens, which is why they're universal donors. But then again, this also means that people with this blood type can only receive blood or organ transfusion from someone with the exact same blood type. If a wrong blood type is introduced into the body's immune system will trigger and attack it, thinking it's a threat to the body. This was exactly what was going on with Jessica. Her blood and organs were type O, and so when the type A organs were introduced into her body, her immune system began to attack them. This is why her new organs turned blue and then purple, and also stopped functioning. Her immune system was literally killing the new organs. It was a shocking discovery, to say the least. So immediately, an emergency situation was declared. Jessica was put on life support, and medical personnel began scrambling to find a second donor. Doctors immediately informed the organization that had sourced for the organs that there had been an issue, and that Jessica was in dire need of new organs. It was the only way to save the poor girl's life. But where would they find a new lung and heart? Who would be the donor? And would they ever complete the surgery in time? Doctors and nurses at the hospital swung into action, pumping Jessica's system full of drugs to shut down her immune system's antibody response on the heart and liver. But rather than make things better, these drugs seemed to be affecting her organs all the more. Jessica began to slip into a coma. Time was running out. Yet, due to the several processes involved in getting an organ donation, the Duke Hospital couldn't just go pick up a new heart and lungs to put in Jessica right away. However, they did their best to make her a prioritized emergency so that organs could be arranged without having to pay another money or adding her to a wait list. Luckily, they were able to find a donor for a second transplant, but it took a few days to get it ready for pickup. It was on February 20th, about 13 days after the initial failed transplant, that doctors received a call to come pick up a new set of organs for Jessica. They wasted no time in prepping her for the surgery, and not long after, it was all set to go. But then, another complication had come up. Jessica had developed further issues, and she, in fact, had gotten really worse. Having to undergo 2 surgeries in quick succession was too stressful for her body to handle, and her body had started to react. But then, this wasn't the only issue. The more pressing issue was that Jessica had developed brain damage. You see, during heart transplantation, the patient's blood is pumped via machine, so the heart can be removed and installed without them dying. During this process, sometimes complications can arise whereby the blood can get clogged inside of the machines. There are also situations where the blood gets pumped with too much or too little force. It wasn't clear if her brain damage was a side effect of her receiving incompatible organs, or a fault during the operation, or if it was a side effect of having undergone multiple surgeries in a short time. But in any case, the damage was irreversible. One issue that doctors suspected was responsible for the brain damage was the anticoagulant drugs that were used to prevent her drugs from clogging during the transplantation process. These drugs can be so powerful that in some cases they cause brain damage when the circulated blood flows to the brain. Jesica was already in terrible shape before the transplant, so it was difficult for her body to resist any side effects from the drugs, like she would have if she was healthy before the operation. In any case, her brain began to swell and she began bleeding inside her skull. As if this wasn't bad enough, her kidneys also failed. Her condition just went from bad to worse, only it was getting worse by the minute. Everybody began to say their prayers for poor Jesica, as her complications had grown out of hand. There was nothing the doctors could do at this point but to hope for a miracle. Then 2 days later, on February 22nd, doctors realized that there was no brain activity coming from her. She was brain dead. Further analysis shows that her brain wasn't receiving any blood flow, so special machines were used to keep her body alive. But for how long? For how long would she keep battling between life and death? These were the exact thoughts that flowed through the mind of doctors who were in charge of the young girl. At some point, they decided it was best to put the young girl's misery to an end. They wanted to pull her off life support. But her parents weren't ready to give up on their daughter just yet. They begged for an extension of her treatment, believing that somehow she could bounce back. Mahoney, the family's benefactor, even demanded for another doctor outside of the hospital to be brought in to handle the case. However, authorities at Duke Medical Center found it pointless to treat a patient who was already brain dead. According to them, she was no longer required to receive any medical treatment as she was not in a vegetative state. In other words, if Jesica was in a coma or in a vegetative state, they would have consulted a high-ranking surgeon to look into her case. However, in Jessica's current condition, all that was left was for her body to give up the ghost. There was no need to keep her on life support at that point. She was already gone. The final decision to pull the plug on Jesica was agreed on. However, at about 5 p.m. that same day, Jessica's heart stopped beating. She was taken off the life support 3 minutes later and declared as officially dead. The brain damage, along with the several other complications, were what consequently led to her death. Jesica died on February 22nd, 2003, at just 17 years old. Her death brought sorrow and dismay to family, friends, and everyone who had been a part of her foundation or supported her. The days following Jessica's death were no less unpleasant, as many found it gravely incompetent for a surgeon at a renowned medical facility to make such a mistake. In fact, when news agencies began to carry reports of Jesica and the controversial situation surrounding her death, it sparked a wild turn of events.
Had you and Carolina Donor Services checked anywhere to determine what her blood type was to ensure that it was a match with the organs that were being donated?
No, we could have requested her blood type, and I wish we had of, but we did not do that.
For one, the doctor in charge of the operation was highly to blame. Before beginning the operation, the surgeon in charge, Dr. Jaggers, should have verified what blood type the donor was. However, he never asked this question. Instead, he trusted the organization, Carolina Donor Services, believing they had already confirmed Jessica's blood group and sourced out matching organs for her. Also, the man who picked up the organs, Dr. Shinho, was informed multiple times that the donor was blood type A. He simply nodded in affirmation and took the organs without first verifying if it was a match. In his defense, no one had informed him what blood type Jesica had, so he had no idea if there was an issue with the organs or not. This was gross negligence. Also, when the organs arrived, the hospital skipped protocol, foregoing blood typing tests. Perhaps this was due to the urgency of the situation, or maybe too much trust in the donor organization. The public pointed fingers at the staff and the Duke Medical Center as a whole. But then, in the eyes of some experts, it was the system that had failed, and the Carolina Donor Services was part of this failed system, even though they had a strict internal policy to verify blood types before issuance. And so Jesica's tragedy was a jointly shared one, caused by many people. Her parents were obviously devastated by her passing, as well as her siblings. But then, amidst mourning their loss, this family did something no one would have expected. It wasn't long after the passing of Jesica that doctors suggested to the family if they would like to give her organs up for donation. You see, though some of Jesica's organs were damaged beyond repair, a few were still good. Surprisingly, her parents bought the idea. They thought it was good to not let all of their daughter's remains get buried and gone forever. If a piece of her was transplanted to another patient, not only would it save a life, it would also seem like a piece of her is still alive in that person. However, Mahoney, the family sponsor, wasn't on board with the idea. As far as Mahoney was concerned, Jesica's doctors had murdered her, and as far as he was concerned, they would murder the next patient who would be set for a transplant operation. Mahoney also informed her parents that due to the high amount of medication that had been pumped into her system to try and revive her, her organs must have become unfit for donation. He was so upset that he wanted to sue the Duke Hospital for their incompetence, which led to Jesica's death after all the money that had been spent on her. This was another reason Mahoney didn't want Jesica's organs removed. He knew the only way to sue the hospital was after an autopsy had been conducted on her. For this autopsy to be done, Jesica's body and internal organs needed to be complete so an accurate cause of death could be determined. In the end, Mahoney got what he wanted. He stopped the donation and also made for an autopsy to be conducted in Jesica. And interestingly, the results were not far from what Mahoney had suspected all along. The chief medical examiner, Dr. John Butts, wrote in the autopsy report that Jesica Santilian died of global cerebral hypoxic injury. It was also stated that this complication arose due to the fact that her body had received an incompatible heart and lungs. This otherwise proved that Jesica would have bounced back to life if only the medical personnel at Duke Hospital were a little more careful and professional in their job. Jesica's autopsy also showed that she suffered renal failure and had a stroke before her death. These two were because of the incompatible organs she received. In the end, it was a big blow to the Santillans and to Mahoney, who had spent so much money, time, and effort to see Jesica smile and live happily again. The damage had already been done, and nothing was going to bring their daughter back. On February 26th, a memorial service was conducted in honor of the young girl. Jesica was buried in the U.S., surrounded by family, friends, and well-wishers who were a part of her journey. It was a sad ending for a beautiful girl with a lovely smile who just wanted to live. And it was a story that touched many lives and taught the medical community many lessons. That's all for this video. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe to enjoy more videos like this. Bye for now.